Good evening and welcome to tonight's program hosted by the Commonwealth Club, Silicon Valley. My name is Terry Gosliner and I'm the Senior Curator and Dean of Science and Research Collections at the California Academy of Sciences. I'm also a marine biologist and invertebrate zoologist. Tonight we have two speakers. Steve Palumbi is the director of the Hopkins Marine Station and is the Harold A. Miller Professor of Marine Science at Stanford University and one of today's leading marine scientists. He has written for numerous publications and has contributed to and been interviewed by BBC Animal Planet, the Discovery Channel, the History Channel, and National Geographic. His film projects include the BBC series The Future is Wild and the History Channel's Life After People. He is the author of The Death and Life of Monterey Bay and The Evolution Explosion, How Humans Cause Rapid Evolutionary Change. His son, Anthony, graduated from Stanford with a bachelor's degree in English and a minor in ultimate frisbee. He has worked in both the film and video game industries before striking out as a writer. Today, he writes about science and video games and has written extensively for Electronic Arts video game, The Sims 3, and also continues consulting for the industry. His nonfiction work about modern culture from the eyes of the next generation has been published by The Atlantic and Think Progress. His fiction has been published by the Peninsula Paper. Tony maintains a blog titled I Drop Things. Steve and Anthony are co-authors of The Extreme Life of the Sea. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Steve and Anthony Palumbi.
I'm Steve. Anthony will be up on stage in a few minutes, and thank you very much for coming out this evening and helping us explore the amazing life of the ocean. And we're just going to launch right into it because the ocean is full of an amazing set of critters, and our goal tonight is to bring them alive, to tell their stories, and to show you the incredible ways that these creatures live across the spectrum of the oceans. And some of you may have had the amazing fortune of seeing creatures like this throw themselves out of the water. These are humpback whales. These pictures were taken off the coast of Angola, but you can see the same things in Monterey Bay and in many places around the world. And these critters are some of the largest animals that have ever lived on the planet. And they have this amazing acrobatic sense. These photos just show you a little bit of the sort of somersaults and turns that humpback whales do as they throw themselves out of the sea. So we can think about this in a lot of different ways. One of them is just how incredibly powerful these images are and how amazing these animals are. As you dig down into it, though, as a marine biologist, you can see all kinds of other layers, and part of what we want to do is talk about some of those layers, the science behind what we know about some of these creatures in the sea, and also how they make us feel, how they enrich our lives, and the kinds of patterns that we see across the ocean. If you're a marine biologist, you look at this and you see a whole bunch of things that might not occur to you right off. One of them is that this animal has very large fins, very large flippers. In fact, it's got the largest flippers of any whale, sometimes up to about a third of the length of the whale. They're very fast animals, and that's kind of an interesting problem. How do you be fast in the ocean when you've got these huge fins that are actually going to slow you down? They're used for the agility when the animals throw themselves out of the water, but they conduct migrations of tens of thousands of miles a year. So why would you want to do that with these big, huge fins that were slowing you down? As you look at them a little more closely, you can see some other features that, in fact, it turns out explains part of what's going on with these fins. You see all those bumps on the front end. Those aren't just, messy details of fin growing. They're actually a built-in feature of these fins. And when people have taken these fins and put them, models of them, in a flume to see what the drag is of these fins, what they discovered is those little bumps, which are enlarged hair follicles on the front of the fin, actually decrease the drag of those fins considerably. So what we see as a big fin and a big drag on the movement of these whales is in fact ameliorated, is in fact made a little better by these bumps. And other people have said, well, actually, if it's good enough for whales, maybe it's good enough for fans. And a new generation of fan blades has been designed with the leading edge bumped up like the fin of a humpback whale, and those fins have 35% less drag in the air or in water and than if those bumps were not there. So by looking at the whales, by seeing some aspects of them that are a little bit odd, and by trying to figure out how these marine critters might actually be adapted well to their environment, sometimes we're able to find innovations that figure into our own technology and our own engineering. So the basic notion is that ocean life really has adapted very well to what could be some very extreme conditions, and that is in fact the purpose of the book. Tony and I sat down to write it from two standpoints. One of them was the science behind the extreme life of the sea, but the other standpoint was the storytelling that we needed to do in order to bring these critters to life. So what we're going to try to do is do both of those at the same time, and to try not only to tell you about how these critters live, some of the details, but some of the dramas that go along with them. If you're talking about extremes, one of the easiest extremes to talk about first is the fastest. What's the fastest thing in the ocean? And we gravitate to flying fish because they move along at a very good clip. You might think, though, they're the fastest fish in the sea because, after all, they're flying, but they're not. And in fact, the drama of this pair of species, flying fish, and these are mahi-mahi, sometimes called dolphin fish. The drama here is that dolphin fish have in their stomachs, more often than not, lots of flying fish. And so it doesn't work all that well, the flying business. And it turns out when you start looking at flying fish, then one of those two names is a lie. Well, they're fish, but they don't fly. In fact, they're gliding fish. Those fins that look like wings are gliding wings. They're not beating wings. They don't beat to move the fish through the air. So the way a flying fish actually flies is it throws itself out of the water. Then it has a tail with a very long back end, and the fish beats that tail in the surface of the water to give itself another propulsive boost. So the propulsion is not from the wings, it's from the tail. And once that animal gets out of the water, it's gliding. It's not flying. Now, what's the property, the most unfortunate property for a fish if you're gliding? You're coming down. And underneath you are the dolphin fish, the mahi-mahi, because they can swim as fast as the flying fish can fly. So once a flying fish is out of the water and underneath it is a mahi-mahi tracking it, that flying fish has a problem. It can't go anywhere but down, and down is where the mahi-mahi is. So this drama plays out all over the tropics. The flying fish comes down, it hits the surface just barely so that it wags its tail in the water and it gives itself another boost of propulsion. And then once it's done that, it'll veer off to the right to try to lose the mahi-mahi under it, but the mahi will track it. And time after time after time, the flying fish will hit the water to try to get a propulsive boost, and that's the point where the mahi-mahi has a chance to get it, has a chance to attack it. And as that drama plays out, sometimes the flying fish survives and moves away, and sometimes it ends up in that dolphin, that mahi-mahi's stomach. Now, by just thinking about the conflict between some of the fastest fish, the mahi, and some of the other fastest fish, the flying fish, we can see how both of them are tuned to try to escape and then try to get their prey. But they are not the fastest fish, even the mahi-mahi. The fastest fish, it turns out, are billfish. The fastest fish are sailfish, which have a recorded speed of over 60 miles an hour in the ocean. They are not only incredibly fast swimmers, but they're fast feeders as well. And I'm going to show you a little video clip here of this sailfish coming behind a fishing boat with its bill feeding. Now, notice how it's just swacking at the bait and then goes away. This fish is swimming at 20 miles an hour. It's using its bill to bat at the bait in order to stun it. And then what it has to do at this speed is hit the prey fish, stun it, turn and gulp it down all in one motion. It's like if you were going for a cup of coffee, but you couldn't stop the car. You had to pick up that cup of coffee off the side of the road at 40 miles an hour and then go on. Now, you might feel like you need to do that getting to work, but in fact, it doesn't work so well. You've got to have lots of coordination for that. The sailfish do that all the time, and they have an additional problem is that they're cold-blooded. And their brains and their eyes and their nervous system at the ocean temperatures that they live in don't work all that fast. So not only do they have to swim fast, but they have to see and brain process fast. So these sailfish and other billfish have evolved heaters. They've evolved heaters in their eyes and in the tops of their brains. And those heaters keep their eyes about 10 degrees above seawater temperature, and it keeps their brains, especially the optic lobes, warm as well. And by keeping their eyes and their brains warm, what it does is allow the sailfish to not only move quickly, but also feed quickly by letting their eyes work fast enough. Well, when you're writing a book about the extreme life of the sea, most people think about sharks. Well, the thing is that sharks aren't all that extreme except for the ferocious ones. They're not the biggest, they're not the fastest, they're not the deepest, they're not the smartest, certainly. They're not even the deadliest ounce by ounce. What they do show, though, we strain to get sharks in this book, is they're the sharpest. They have the sharpest teeth. They have actually the sharpest grown structure in the biological world. Shark teeth, like this one, are 3 times sharper than a razor blade. Now, how do we make a razor blade? How do we make something sharp? We make it thin and then beat it or hone it or somehow polish it down to a really thin edge. But you can't do that if you're a shark growing teeth. You have to grow something sharp. And the way sharks grow their sharp teeth took a long time to figure out. Essentially, the sharp edge is just one line of cells. And that one line of cells throws up a set of filaments, one line of cells thick, and those filaments fill in with dentine to make the sharp edge of a shark's tooth. So that's how they manage to grow them sharp. They don't stay sharp for very long, though. And so the other thing that sharks invented 418 million years ago was tooth replacement. Sharks don't grow one set of teeth. They grow an entire set of teeth next to their other teeth. They're constantly making them. And if we look at the way that happens here, the tooth that is being used now is there on the left. It's the sharpest tooth. It's what the shark is biting with. But all behind it are a whole other set of teeth that are growing. They start way down in the throat. As they grow, they move forward. And as the smaller ones move forward, then the ones that are being used get dull through use and then fall out. So sharks are constantly growing and shedding teeth in order to keep them as sharp as possible. This is a strategy that they started when sharks evolved 418 million years ago. They were the only ones in the ocean with teeth. They invented teeth. Now, a lot of us have teeth now. It was a good idea. But sharks are the ones that invented it. And the reason why they've been so successful for so many hundreds of millions of years is because they have these incredible, incredible teeth. Well, the stories of sharks and the stories of teeth and how they match are sort of a set of interacting sets of information and perceptions. And I'm going to turn the podium over now to Tony, who's going to talk a little bit about how we blend those together, the storytelling part of a book. It's not just about the science, it's about the stories themselves. So I'll turn the podium over to Tony, and he'll explain what these images are about.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Tony Palumbi. I'm a freelance writer based in San Mateo, just up the highway, and I am somewhat obviously Steve's son. This book, like he said, started out as a sort of collaboration, well, as an experiment. It was a collaboration. It started out as a sort of experiment to see whether or not our two very different approaches, our very different skill sets, could describe science and the natural world in a way that was different and hopefully better than what most people were being exposed to, whether that means dry, imposing academic textbooks or hyperbolic wackiness in the vein of Shark Week. So we set out to write a marine science book without compromise. We'd fill it with the best, most cutting-edge science, the freshest research, but we'd also search the oceans for the most exciting stories. And we'd tell those stories with colorful characters, with rich descriptions, with the sorts of things that are my specialty. And we'd see if that approach couldn't assemble something really great. Now, the narrative tradition has always existed in science, but where it's existed, it's mostly been big stories about big people for the most part. Scientists, naturalists, explorers. There are a million biographies of Charles Darwin out there, for example, and some of them are very good, but the extreme life of the sea was always going to be more of a survey. There wasn't necessarily going to be a single narrative thread connecting every element of the book. So for that reason, we adopted a more granular approach. By granular, I mean focused on small things, on individuals, on small populations, on local environments, because we believe that not only are these stories crucially important, but if those stories are told well, they'll open people's minds to otherwise intimidating discussions about science, about conservation, because a lot of this information isn't really that hard to digest. It just seems like that at first blush. There's an issue of intimidation to get past. So the question becomes, how do you do that, right? How do you tell these stories in a compelling way, particularly if you're not a professional writer or a speaker as gifted as Steve is, or maybe you're not even working in your first language. But regardless, there are some techniques you can use to pull people into your stories and keep them there. And that's sort of what I hope to bring to the project. So a lot of that, the most important thing for me personally is sensory detail. You can really bring people into your stories by presenting them with compelling sensory immersion. By that I mean not just that you're describing something, but that you're zooming in close enough to reveal something interesting about your describing, something that's tactile, something that can connect emotionally to the audience. Sight and sound are good ways to do this. Touch, taste, and smell end up being really fantastic. They sort of interact more with our elemental, primordial lizard brains. It's easier for whatever reason to bind emotions to touch, taste, and smell than it is just sight and sound. So to give you an example of sort of how we tried to use this multisensory approach in the book, I'm going to read a passage now from our Most Ancient Species chapter. This passage has to do with horseshoe crabs on the Atlantic coast. And it's what's described in this picture, which is why this picture's been up. Ocean City, Maryland is a tectonic boundary between nature and artifice. Built on a spit of a sandbar on the sandy mid-Atlantic coast, the city is in constant conflict with the sea. At the southern end stands a glittering entertainment strip, complete with video arcades and a Ferris wheel embodying a particular halcyon vision of American glory. Few places are more iconic than an aging Atlantic coast boardwalk, parents explaining to their unimpressed kids how great this used to be, omnipresent stickiness under their feet, storefront tchotchkes appealing to nostalgia and affronting good taste in equal measure. But the boardwalk's only a century old, really, and just a stone's throw away, 400-million-year-old structures are scuttling up the beach. The best way to learn about horseshoe crabs is simply to turn one over. Be warned, though the animals are harmless, most beachgoers are unprepared for the calcified nightmare that lies beneath. 10 long, spindly, claw-tipped legs reach and curl like skeleton fingers. They emerge from a glittering insectoid thorax between a heavy abdomen and thin head adorned with tough feelers. and a carapace like a sci-fi helmet. Lacking jaws or teeth, horseshoe crabs grind up food with their legs and shuttle it to a tiny sucking sphincter of a mouth on their bellies. These creatures resemble nothing so much as aliens from another planet. So you'll notice the movement in that passage. First, setting the scene in Ocean City, supplementing that with some very concrete sensory details related to the boardwalk, and a very precise, sort of widely familiar emotion, which is that feeling of early to mid 20th century American nostalgia. And we move from that familiar place to the edge of the scene, to the crab, and we just sort of flush out all that warm, familiar feeling with a kind of clammy, Lovecraftian horror vibe. You know, the claws, the moist carapace. Moisture in general is a really good trick I've found. Like moisture is a sort of sensory base that can be taken in many different directions very quickly. I'll leave you to imagine what those might be, but the point is that you should seek out images that excite you, that send a chill down your spine, that make your heart race. And if you're able to do that, then you immediately open people's minds up to the experiences you're presenting them. I'd say that's really my number one go-to immersion technique, is picking an intense sensory experience and relating that as completely and as honestly and as clearly as I can. But it's not always enough to just set the scene, right? Immersion is a wonderful technique. It's very powerful, but there's always a risk people take away the wrong lessons from immersion. You know, just because we had a polar vortex in the Northeast recently doesn't mean that the world's not getting hotter. We need scientific rigor, scientific detail to bind us, to keep us away from thinking what we're seeing in front of us right now is all there is, to provide perspective on the awe-inspiring natural world all around us. And for a little more on that, how exactly we've come to know these amazing things about the sea and all the scientific details associated with them, I'm going to turn it back over to Steve, and he's going to talk about how we know these things.
Great. Did you get that cutting edge science right after the shark tooth thing? One of the things that we were able to do by writing a book about these different places is to transport people into amazingly different environments just from the pages of a simple book. And we have a chapter about the hottest places in the ocean. We have a chapter about the coldest ones as well, and the way organisms live in those coldest places in some ways really stretches our imagination. This is a fabulous photo by John Weller. It's in our book. He let us use it. And what's shown here at the top is not the clouds. The top is the ice on the top of the Antarctic Sea. This bunch of starfish there is about 60 feet down. The water is crystal clear in the Antarctic. And what you see as white fleece all over the bottom are ice crystals. This seawater is at the freezing point of the ocean. It's about -2 degrees. Salt water freezes a little lower than other water, and so this is as cold as a place as any organism in the ocean lives. Well, not only the starfish live there, but a wide variety of other species do, including these. These are called ice fish. Now, the problem if you're an ice fish is that you're living in water that's -2 degrees, but your blood is not as salty as the ocean. And in fact, your blood freezes before the water around you does. This is a bad thing if you're a fish and your blood freezes inside you. And these ice fish then have evolved a whole set of proteins called ice proteins in their blood that bind to ice crystals. And they keep those ice crystals from growing. They suppress the growth of those ice crystals. So that means the blood can flow and not fill up with ice, even at -2 degrees in the Antarctic. Our Antarctic ice fish have these ice proteins. North Atlantic fish have these ice proteins. Some plants and insects do as well. And we can sort of see viscerally what some of the problems of that are if we think about ice cream. Maybe before dinner you're thinking about ice cream too, but in ice cream with lots of fat in it, they're very small ice crystals. But if you try to take some of the fat away and have more watery ice cream, you get these very big, large ice crystals. People don't like that. As a consequence, what very clever people have done is realize that if you substitute ice proteins in the ice cream for some of that fat, then the ice crystals themselves can be coated by these ice proteins, and they stop growing. And so as a way of making ice cream that doesn't have as much fat in it as other ice cream, but still doesn't have those big chunky bits of ice, these are called slow churned ice creams or light ice creams. What scientists have done is actually take the gene from the northern Atlantic eel pout and make that protein, and then use that ice protein in ice cream to allow the ice cream to have less fat content, less cholesterol, and it still doesn't make those big, huge chunks of ice in your freezer. So slow churned ice cream is built around the technology that comes from ice fish. We can move to other habitats like the deepest parts of the ocean that have amazing fish in them that live in almost total darkness. These are the loose jaws. And stoplight loose jaws have the amazing property of beaming out red light so that they can see their prey. Thing is that other fish could see the red light too, except that the stoplight loose jaw is the only fish that can see red. All the other fish in the deep sea see blue and green, but this loose jaw can see red and then beams out red light in order to find its prey. Other animals in the ocean, especially the deep sea, have other remarkable adaptations to the dark and the deep and the aloneness of being in the deep sea. This is an anglerfish. All anglerfish of this species that have ever been caught are females. And for a long time, biologists didn't know where the males were. Were there any males at all? Till finally an intrepid biologist figured out where the males are. Do you know? There. It's basically at the back, the bottom end. That is not a bump or a fin, that's a male. Stuck to that female. The males of this species find the females by swimming around. They're pretty ugly when they start out. They find them through big nostrils and big eyes. Attached to the females, they immediately lose their brains, lose their ability to feed themselves, lose their guts. They become ultimate, complete, and total parasites on the females, and they're only sitting there waiting for her to spawn so they can fertilize her eggs. So this is an adaptation for how big the deep sea is and how difficult it is for males to find females. As we move through different parts of the ocean and see how different organisms actually can react and live in different extreme environments, we can only think a little bit about what lies in store for marine critters into the future. Future extremes of our planet are actually going to tax marine organisms to come up with adaptations necessary to live in the future. And at this point, I'm going to turn the podium back to Tony so he can tell you a little bit of how we've addressed the idea of future extremes in the book and try to basically bring us into the picture.
So if we had a single statement of purpose for this project, Extreme Life of the Sea, it would be that nobody cares about a story until they care about the characters. That idea of immersion I talked about earlier is a fine technique for a paragraph, a passage, a scene, or a section, but it's not enough to carry a whole book on its own. Immersion, for all its many wonderful qualities, turns out to be it's an insufficient vehicle on its own to communicate really big ideas. And big ideas are why we have language to begin with, right? To communicate the ideas we can't communicate just by drawing a picture or by pointing and expressively grunting. So the hardest part for me of this project ended up being those last chapters that Steve talked about, the future extremes, where we switch from having a sort of colorful survey of the way the oceans are to a grimmer essay on what's going to happen to them and the coming realities of climate change and what need to be done about them. That's always the hardest part of any presentation, right? That moment where you switch from presenting something to selling it to somebody, to telling them what they're supposed to do about it. Your audience is very smart. They're used to being sold things all the time by people who throw around terms like call to action in casual conversation. So the defenses sort of go up again. And I found the best way to keep those defenses down is by introducing interesting characters. Now, being characters, there will be things that they want. There will be challenges that appear to thwart them, and they'll struggle against those challenges to achieve what they want. But pick the right characters and place them in the right settings, and you'll provide your audience with a very clear idea of what the moral stakes of that story are. And you'll do that without having to necessarily come out and tell them. You'll have sort of incepted your ideas naturally into the audience. They'll come to the right conclusions from your stories because your characters can give those stories a compelling moral framework without you having to necessarily tell them, oh, these are the most important things and this is why you care about them. It'll just become obvious. So to show you a little bit about how we tried to do that, I'm going to read a passage from the Future Extremes chapter. To set the scene, we have two scientists going on a nighttime dive for seahorses in the Philippines. Both are dressed in wetsuits with tanks and regulators. Masks, flashlights, steel knives, digital watches, and dive computers round out their expensive equipment. The Filipino boatman, piloting his tiny hand-carved bangka, wears a fraying pair of swim trunks along with goggles carved from a coconut husk and 2 discs of Coke bottle glass. A kerosene lantern casts wan light from the bow. With soft splashes, each of the 3 goes over the side. The collectors set out to seek their favorite seahorses. The boatman takes off alone, frog kicking down towards the reef, his bare feet a stark contrast to the diver's oversized black rubber flippers. He's got a family to feed and his own seahorses to catch, for sale rather than science. The researchers surface after an hour, cold and tired, unable to find more than 1 specimen. The pilot ferries them back to shore, but once their gear is unloaded, he heads immediately back out to sea. For the next 8 hours, he'll swim shivering through the dark water, finally returning near dawn with his own seahorse. It's only 1 animal, the length of your long finger, but he sells it for 25 cents. That's enough to buy a few cups of rice, which means his wife and children will eat for another day. When the sun goes down, though, he'll return once again to hunt all night on the reef. So that's a powerful image, and there are sensory elements to it, right? The disparity in diving gear, that sensation of bitter, soaked to the bone cold. But the thing that really makes it work is the figure of that boatman, that character, because he ends up representing in a very small, concise space a lot of really big, emotionally resonant ideas. The first of which is, like Steve talked about, the depletion of the natural world, the degree to which it turns out that a lot of the animals that are currently being threatened by human activity never really lived that far from the brink of survival anyway, and it's our activity that's pushing them off. But second, even more than those animals, he represents everyone with a connection to the natural world, which is ultimately all of us. We all rely on natural resources. We need those resources to be replenished, and we suffer when they aren't. So when we harm marine environments, we're not just harming corals and fish and animals like that. We're causing concrete harms to real people, often in very impoverished communities like the one I just described. And those communities are very different, from how we live, but even so, I think in wealthy countries, we can find a sort of resonance with the figure of the boatman, with our ongoing economic struggles, with the concern a lot of people have these days, the feeling that what used to be enough isn't quite enough anymore. What used to work isn't quite working. And for whatever reason, it's taking more struggle, more work just to accomplish the things that we used to take for granted. And if, like the boatman, you were never really, you were never thriving, even in the best of times, it can only take a small mishap to push your head below water. So this one character ends up representing a whole lot of different ideas and concerns in a very small space without having to come out and spell out what all those things are. It would be, I think it would feel a little bit phony if we'd gone that direction. So setting up characters like this is a great way to tell stories. It can be very effective, and I mean, we've had a great response to this project, this book so far, but what's been personally most rewarding for me was that people from reviewers to readers really seem to get it. They got the big ideas, why these animals are so important, and why it's crucial that we work to save the natural world. And if you tell these stories, so I think that sort of shows that if you tell these stories right, they will impact people's thinking on science, on conservation, and they'll get them talking about the sorts of concrete policy steps that need to be taken in order to preserve this natural world in anything like the condition that we've known it, and to fill you in on what exactly those policy changes would be, what the world would look like under them. I'm going to turn it back over to Steve, who's going to take us home the rest of the way. Thank you very much for having me here tonight.
I think we'll have some time during the question and answers to talk about a lot of these sorts of issues. What we want to do is sort of leave you with the idea that the life of the sea is an incredible diversity and is adapted to survive in many, many, many different environments. What we've discovered by activities like Tony was talking about, overfishing, adding nutrients to the water, sedimentation, is that the ocean can be damaged by humans. What we've also discovered is that when we relent and we leave the ocean alone, even in small places that are called marine protected areas along the California coast, or in this case, in the Philippines, the ocean bounces back. Marine life thrives and grows so quickly in these sorts of cases that protection can allow it to come back, even from places and conditions that are really quite severe. That is our power over the ocean, that we can change it for the worse, but we can also allow its own intrinsic power to change it for the better. This is a photograph of bumphead wrasse in the Philippines. This is very close to where the story that Tony read you took place. That fisherman was searching for 8 hours for anything bigger than his thumb. Just a few hours of travel away, this area, because it's protected from enormous overfishing, is thriving with big fish that you wouldn't see anywhere else. Just an example of the way the ocean can thrive and come back. Tony told you what the main kinds of philosophy are behind the book. If you don't care about, you do not care about the plot of the ocean until you care about the characters. And so our goal in this is to bring those characters to life. And why? So that all of these amazing creatures could still actually live in our oceans in the future. We do have a negative effect on the oceans all around us, but we still have a choice about how the oceans will do in the future, and by making the right choices to let ocean life live the way it can live, then we can preserve that ocean today, and we can preserve it for our children and our children's children into the future. So thank you very, very much.
Well, thanks so much, Steve and Tony, for sharing your insights and the beauty and the extremes of the world's oceans. And I think we would all agree that your noble experiment of working together from different perspectives with different talents was an overwhelming success, and congratulations.
Thank you.
We have some questions from the audience, and I'm going to start with one of the questions that I have before I turn to the audience, the moderator's prerogative, as it's called. And one of the things that strikes me in reading your book is that there are so many extremes. That are there normal, less extreme organisms in the ocean, or is the ocean such a particular place and so different from our world that everything seems extreme?
That's a great question. I hadn't quite thought of it that way. You know, there's, of course, less extreme things in the ocean, but I'd say if you really dig down for any character in the ocean, if you really dig down, you realize that they do some pretty wacky things. Even the normal ones. We have a section about hermit crabs. Hermit crabs are pretty unextreme critters, right? They're just little crabs running around in shells. But the way they get their shells and fight one another for their shells and exchange their shells is an incredible story of cooperation and bitter conflict and trust and deception all at the same time. So that's not a very extreme critter, a hermit crab, but within their stories you can find all kinds of things like that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, let me turn to a couple of the audience questions now. A couple of them are really straightforward. What is the deadliest creature in the sea?
So you want to?
Yeah. So the deadliest creature in the sea is really kind of intuitively disappointing. It's a snail. It's a snail, only about 3 inches long, something like that. It's called a cone snail, and it's a snail that hunts fish, which seems really bizarre. Like, how on earth could a snail ever catch a fish? But it turns out that it catches a fish basically the same way we do, with a harpoon. It's got a little tooth that it can shoot out on a sort of wire, and stick fish with it, in which point it injects what is essentially the world's most ridiculously, absurdly powerful nerve toxin. And the fish is just instantly paralyzed and killed, and then the snail sort of eats it in a macabre spectacle. But I think that that venom is so powerful. It kills a fish. It's easy to kill little fish. It can kill humans. This is a 3-inch long snail that can even I'm sorry, the microphone. It can, if you pick it up and put it in your pocket, like, oh, this is a fun thing to carry home. It could even conceivably stick you through the lining of a bathing suit and cause serious illness or even death. So these sorts of capabilities aren't always obvious. That no one would really know this unless a huge amount of very difficult, time-consuming research had been poured into it to discover how exactly these snails worked and how venomous exactly they are.
I have to sort of add that this deadliest animal in the ocean is sort of deadliest ounce by ounce. You typically think of big, enormous sharks as being pretty deadly. But there's really only about 4 or 5 species that are really any kind of deadly encounters with people. The vast majority of them are quite innocuous.
All this time, I thought humans were the deadliest creatures. What is the smartest animal in the ocean?
So we had a debate about that. And it turns out that ocean critters are smart in different ways. So one of the smartest ways of being an ocean critter is to just completely and utterly avoid human beings. That seems like a really smart thing. So giant squid are really smart in that way. We barely know they're there. We've seldom seen them. We have no ability whatsoever to affect their populations. We can't fish them. We can't really hurt them. And so they're just off the radar screen. So that strikes me as being really smart. And maybe there's even a smarter one that we just don't even know about, period. Something deep in the ocean that we've never seen. On the other side, the other 2 contenders are dolphins. Incredible societies, very vocal, incredible learning capacities, incredible social networks and cultural networks, and then octopus. a very different brain, not a brain like ours, but a brain that's distributed around its body. Of course, it has a central brain, but each of those tentacles has a remarkable capacity for just controlling itself. So it's more like a committee than a real brain, but those committees, at least for octopus, seem to work pretty well.
But at the same time, those sorts of decentralized brains, you know, they're limiting in certain ways, but in other ways they open up new things that you wouldn't necessarily think about. Like you think about how amazing an octopus or a cuttlefish's camouflage is, right? I don't know if you've ever seen videos or picture, but they have this incredible ability to mimic not just color and pattern, but texture, well, apparent texture. And that sort of thing is only made possible by their decentralized nervous system. Because if you look at anything with a centralized brain that has camouflage, like a chameleon or just anything like that, it's very clumsy camouflage. It's like it's thinking. It has to think about what it wants to do and try and communicate that in a top-down way to its body, whereas the octopus's sort of distended nervous system goes into the skin, and the skin can process that information for itself. And it does so, it turns out, much more clearly and quickly and effectively than a centralized brain ever could, just operating at the lowest level of existence.
Fascinating. What, in your opinion, is the future of manatees? Will manatees in various regions of the Earth, West Africa, the Caribbean, South America, or the Amazonian region, face equally challenges and dangers of extinction in the coming decades?
Manatees, I think, are one of the kinds of species that really needs our help. They live in places that we like to dominate. Manatees in general living in coastal areas with lots of vegetation, mangroves, seagrasses, estuaries all around. Those are places we like to build ports. Those are places we like to put fishing villages. Those are places that we like to wholesale change the vegetation on. So we have a real estate problem with manatees, and unless we're able to control that and allow a certain amount of that real estate to go back to the manatees, then their slow, gentle, herbivorous lives are not going to thrive into the future. So I think they're one of the species that we really have to pay particular attention to and allow them to have the resources that they need to do their job. You leave them alone, they're fine. They can reproduce, have nice populations. We just have to give them a chance.
So, are different populations more heavily threatened than others of manatees?
You know, I don't know that much about different populations of manatees, but wherever human population is most intense and dense, then they're having more of a problem.
Could you talk a little bit more about biomimicry with ocean creatures? And you know, this questionnaire was struck by the whole fin of the humpback whale. And are there other really good examples of that kind of biomimicry that we have employed for human invention, basically using marine science models of living organisms?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there's a large industry of that going on out in engineering. Some of the new things that people have been doing are actually at the molecular level by finding not just the way fins are built, but say how bacteria in the ocean process wastes, for example, how they make oil. The whole field called synthetic biology is finding marine phytoplankton, single cells, and looking for the ones that produce the best, most purest oil. Why? Because it's a potential source of biofuels into the future. And by tweaking the genes of some of these species, they can change these species from making just oil to jet fuel. So there's a species of marine algae now that makes jet fuel. and the idea is to be able to process that and produce fossil fuels without the fossils.
Okay, great. Adult fish reproduce. Why not fish for juveniles? Aren't fishing rules backwards?
Well, imagine catching all the juveniles. Then what? So fish do, in fact, reproduce when they get to be adults. And there had been some kinds of fishing regulations that, in fact, do exactly what the questioner has suggested, to say, let fish grow up to a certain amount and then catch them when they're relatively small. But once they get to a certain size, then leave them alone. And the funny thing about fish and their reproduction is that as they grow, they reproduce more and more and more. That's true of fish and lobsters and corals and a lot of marine organisms. And so a fish that is 20 years old and that big might make 100 times the number of eggs as a fish that's 10 years old and only half the size. So there's an idea of saving the big ones so that they can replenish the populations. And those tend to work. It's also why marine protected areas tend to work, because that lets the big fish grow and live for longer. And as a consequence, there's more egg production, and it means the next generation can come along a little bit better. The only problem is that how many of you have ever heard a fisherman boast about the small fish that they caught? So it gets back to the sort of some of the things that Tony was talking about in terms of the way humans interact with the ocean is often the way humans interact with each other and ourselves. And we like to catch big fish.
Yeah, and we're sort of prisoners of perspective in that regard. Something that came up when researching this book was surprising to me just how often fisheries and other resources were badly mismanaged for up to decades in cases because we just didn't understand the life cycles and life histories of these animals. There's sort of a natural presumption that they must live the way we do, must have the sort of same kind of biological systems that we primates do. And that's just not the case. Like Steve talked about, a lot of the best parents are the oldest parents in the marine world. And a lot of it, we're used to older people not being able to reproduce anymore. That's not the case for a lot of marine organisms. This is, by the way, how you end up with the term whale menopause in your Google search history. Trying to figure out to what, and it's kind of an unresolved question. I expected there to be a clear answer. There was not. We don't know nearly as much about the life history of these animals as we probably should.
I think that's really true. We don't. I didn't write this question, but it says, my favorite animals are nudibranchs and cuttlefish. Nudibranchs happen to be my specialty. Comment, please, on the variety of species that show that evolution hasn't killed off species we regard as more primitive. Things like the horseshoe crab, for example. Why are they still around?
I'm going to have a really hard time coupling that to nudibranchs and cuttlefish. Is that okay?
That's okay.
Okay. You want to do the Volkswagen thing?
Right. So the analogy we use in the book is that a lot of those archaic animals are similar to like an old Type 1 Volkswagen Beetle, in that there's nothing really that impressive about it. That if you look at if you look at an old like 1960 Volkswagen today, there's like no single feature of it is that great. Like you can point it to modern cars and say like, oh, this is better, this is better, this is better. But it turns out that that evolution isn't really about finding the absolute best solution. It just needs to find something that works. And so in the case of the Volkswagen, you have a combination of features like, oh, this air-cooled engine, and the engine is over the drive wheels as opposed to not. There's just a number of different features that make those cars work really well and continue to work really well for a long time, regardless of newer, better cars that come out. So evolution doesn't really, the distinction that the question asks between more advanced and less advanced animals is a distinction that we make. It's a very self-serving distinction, actually, if you think about it. We think of ourselves as the pinnacle of something, when in fact we're just the end of a particular little tributary of something. So evolution doesn't really care about how advanced an animal is. It cares about whether that animal is still able to survive and be successful in its own environment. If the answer is yes, then there's really no reason that they can't stick around for hundreds of millions of years.
So one of the things you talked about was the recovery of Apo Island in the Philippines, and I've observed in the Philippines that some of the reefs that I study are in better shape than when I first started studying them 20 years ago, and that's really due to the care of local communities and people who really get it, that they want to secure a future and protect those reefs for their coming generations. And given that, how do those communities, how can they cope with the more global issues of climate change and coral bleaching, ocean acidification, when they're doing all the right things and yet an ocean away, we're creating challenges that they still have to contend with in those communities?
Yeah, Terry, we've thought about that. There's a section in the book about future extremes and the coupling of local problems and global problems. And what people have found over and over is that and the global problems, say, of CO2 emissions come down, and they affect marine organisms all over the world. They affect them by slowing their growth or by increasing their mortality. You can think of them as a tax on the vitality of marine organisms everywhere. And local communities can't do very much about that. But what they can do is they can solve some of the local problems that are also taxes on the vitality of their local marine systems. And as you point out in the Philippines and other places, by solving some of those local problems, they reap the benefits of the vitality of their local marine life coming back. Yes, they still have the global problems that are there, but by solving their own local problems, then they can keep going with their own ocean use for as long as possible. And one of the things that we've tried to point out in the back end of the book is that when we're talking about saving the oceans, we're really talking about saving ourselves, because we use the oceans, we depend upon the oceans, we depend upon the products they produce. People all over the world do. And so it's not just about saving dolphins or the diversity of life. It's in addition saving us.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. One next quick question: do jellyfish have brains?
No.
Okay.
They have a sort of neural network. They're able to respond to stimuli in the way that any kind of successful animal has to, but no, nothing even close to what we would consider a brain.
But they make a living.
Exactly.
So
you don't need one.
It works. So I think we're at the point where we only have time for 2 more questions. So let me try and ask a couple of quickies. What can the average citizen do to protect the ocean? That may not be a quickie, but maybe you can give a quickie answer to that.
Yeah, the average person can protect the ocean by reducing the kinds of impacts that we all have day to day. It could be something as simple as taking those shopping bags to the grocery store and not using so many plastic bags, and so fewer plastic bags end up washing into the ocean and choking turtles. Those kinds of things actually do make a difference. Not if just one of us does them, but if many of us do them. Small effects over many people can make a big difference. we can have a stronger effect on how the oceans are fished by choosing what it is we consume as seafood. By making careful choices about the seafood that we eat and insisting upon some aspect of sustainable fishing, then we can send a signal through the entire market chain that the market actually responds to. So we have a lot of power to change how corporations use the ocean by choosing how we spend our money with respect to that.
And even more, you can talk about these issues with people. You can talk about global climate change as though it were the sort of impending existential crisis that it is. There's this, even we're facing a really serious problem, just even aside from the local issues, which are going to be very important, as we've said, to preserving anything that we've enjoyed in the natural world. But the issue of climate change is really the sort of big thing looming over this, and there's no easy answer to that except that it needs to be treated like the kind of genuine existential crisis that it is. Even I read things about people talking about, oh, well, there's so many people connected on the internet now that like eventually human ingenuity will solve this problem. Well, even if that happened today, even if we waved a magic wand and cut off all our carbon emissions to zero by the end of the week, things would still get worse for what, 50 years? Yeah, about 50 years, just because of the carbon that we already put into the atmosphere and is just waiting to cycle into the system. So, and the longer we wait, the longer we hope that some sort of sci-fi singularity will coalesce out of Twitter, like. Which I don't know if you've seen Twitter recently. It's not that likely, but the longer we wait, the longer that stopping distance gets going. So it's really not an issue. It's really not something where we can afford to wait. So just the idea of popular urgency, of everyone understanding that this is a really big problem, will go a long way, I think.
One last thing about that is coming back to the idea of caring about the characters. In this case, the characters of the life of the ocean, and knowing a little bit about those and caring about that, finding them interesting, finding that knowing about them enriches our lives is another way of just saying, well, that contributes to the value that we place on the ocean, and the more value we place on the ocean, the easier it will be to save it.
Thank you very much. I think we need to close there, and I hope you've enjoyed this evening's program, brought to you by the Commonwealth Club, Silicon Valley, and Wonderfest. Again, we'd like to thank Steve and Tony Palumbi, co-authors of Extreme Life of the Sea, our audience here in Los Altos, and those of you joining on the radio. And now, the meeting of the Commonwealth Club is adjourned. Thanks very much. And
Must be